Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest in the MillerKnoll Insight series online. My name is Mark Catchlove and I lead the MillerKnoll Insight Group. And in case you don't know, MillerKnoll is a family of brands and they're all listed in front of you. And all these brands design and manufacture products for places where people live, where they learn, where they get healed, and where they work. And I'm really pleased today to have our guest, Ryan Anderson, who is the Vice President of Global Research and Planning at MillerKnoll. I'll let him tell a little bit more about himself, but he's going to be talking a lot more about technology and relationships. Ryan, looking forward to a great session. Please use the chat box for observations and questions as we go along. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you, my friend. Hey, thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate that you've invested this time with us. I also, before I move off this slide, I should just do a quick shout out. A lot of the brands within the MillerKnoll collective have a history of exploring or doing tech research. Knoll, Herman Miller, Muto did a fascinating experiment with Google at Salone that we covered on our podcast. But in particular, big shout out to our friends right up at the top at Colebrook Boston Sanders. If you don't know the company that we call CBS, they have this amazing history of supporting people using technology in really healthy ways. And I think I saw Stephen, who is their lead ergonomist and insight share on the call. So, you know, when it comes to, in particular, ergonomics, the broad view of ergonomics, physical, cognitive, social, they are as good as it gets. So shout out to you, my friends. Yeah, so pleased you're joining us today. We're going to be talking about technology, and we call this technology and togetherness, but in the interest of just being more direct and transparent, we're hoping that this conversation helps to pivot the conversation around technology in the workplace. And more specifically, I hope that we can shift from a question that dominates our conversations to a different question that hopefully will be a priority and dominate our conversations. And I'll get to those questions in a minute. I'll tell you just a little bit about my personal journey. I'll only take a second. For me, this intersection of technology in the workplace has been about an 18-year journey. I launched a product, a technology product in the industry for one of our competitors called Mediascape around 2007. I joined Herman Miller as Director of Future Technology, which was an R&D role in 2012. Worked on a bunch of cool stuff. Left to go to a prop tech or property tech company called Team, T-E-E-M, as VP of Product Marketing, and then we sold that to WeWork, where they gave me the unusual title of Head of Technology Evangelism. I don't know that I'll be evangelizing today, but it was a unique role. And then I came back to Herman Miller, actually within the IT group. I was VP of Digital Innovation before taking my current role leading our research and planning team. And so I kind of looked at technology from a wide variety of perspectives: R&D, marketing, innovation, and I think it's one of the most important topics we can talk about. But as I'll indicate, I'm not sure the conversations that I see happening are as productive to getting really good outcomes as far as workplace or the experience for workers or the organizational outcomes that we're hoping for. So we're going to dive into that. Let me tell you just a little bit about our team. This is just one of the most, probably the most talented, most awesome group of people I've ever worked with. There's about 30 of us. This was actually taken in Austin for those from Austin, Texas. We were gathered together in September at one of our customer sites at Atlassian. But this group, what do? We lead our research. That's primary and secondary research. It's qualitative, it's quantitative. We love doing it with others. We like to partner up on our research. We don't outsource it, but we like go in and learn together. That includes a bunch of tech companies, by the way. But it also includes our sharing of insights on things like this webinar, our podcast, articles, and then we offer workplace strategy and design services as well to be able to apply what we learn from the research to actual projects, and then we learn from those projects and it feeds back in the research. I'll also just take a moment to say that unlike some of our key competitors, we don't charge for those services. We value our collaboration with friends in the A&D and commercial real estate community. So when we walk in a room, we want to make sure everybody sees us as a helpful friend, not a competitor. But as it pertains to the topic of technology, I mean, you can imagine we've looked at it from a research standpoint, from an application standpoint, and we talk about tech a lot. In fact, it just came up on our team call yesterday. I also should just pause for a second and give a big shout out to Mark. and to Bertie, who's a couple people to his left on the back, because not to bring up a sore topic, but we're coming up on 5 years since the start of pandemic quarantine. And this webinar series was Mark and Bertie and others' idea of how to reach people in a way other than in person. And I think we've had almost 30,000 people join this. I mean, the signups continue to get really good. I think we kind of thought maybe we'd wind it down at some point, but the webinars have become a critical way for us to just share insights. Today, I would say that I'm sharing a point of view based on those insights to help further the dialogue about the topic of technology. And my goal is just that we are in greater conversation about it. We've got about a 50-plus year history of technology research within MillerKnoll. A lot of it was stuff done at Herman Miller. I won't go too long here, but in 1968, when the world saw the first personal computer, an event that in the tech world is known now as the mother of all demonstrations, the mother of all demos. In 1968 at Stanford, the world saw the first personal computer. Herman Miller, one individual in particular, Jack Kelly, who just passed a little over a year ago, but I had the pleasure of knowing him, was the person who designed the environment for it. And he was part of the team. So he actually went out there and he saw this keyboard attached to a console and said, can you split that off kind of like a typewriter? It'd be better for the user. And so that created the keyboard as we know it. And then Jack, look what he did with this Eames fiberglass chair and the early version of Action Office. He created the first keyboard tray, mouse pad for the first mouse. The guy in the picture, Doug Engelbart, created the first mouse. I mean, it was really a seminal moment. And we've been pretty much investigating technology in the workplace, and that's why I came over to Miller in 2012. Right after I came over, a group of us worked with the head of user experience at Microsoft, right when Skype was turning into Teams, about all the different ways video could be used and just the nature of collaboration in general. It was really interesting because this was the first time that we sensed that technology people, when they use the term collaboration, meant something very different than how we use the term. It almost always for them meant an individual with their device by themselves, on a video call or asynchronously working on documents. The view of collaboration through a tech lens was not co-located in a room, synchronous sort of activities. So boy, this was a big project for us. More recently, we partnered with Sheila in the picture at Slack, as well as the head of research, Christina Janzer, to co-found, along with Boston Consulting Group, what probably was the biggest quantitative research study on the future of work during the pandemic, called Future Forum. We surveyed 10,000 people every quarter. I actually share a little bit of that when we go on, but on the right is a group of organizations that we've done exploration or actual co-development with just in the last 10 years. I know MillerKnoll is not the sort of brand to go beat our chests around what we know about technology, primarily because we're trying to promote very human-centric spaces, but tech's part of what we do. Okay, so with that introduction, I told you that I'd like to shift the primary question that we ask or discuss on the topic of technology. And what I was getting at was the question that we have found has dominated this conversation for the last 40 years is, how do we support the use of technology at work? Not a bad question to ask. We should still ask the question. However, given the nature of how technology has evolved, the nature of our work today, and what we've discovered in our research people are seeking, I don't think it's the best question to start with. The better question to start with is, how do we balance the use of technology in the workplace? Or if I can push it even a little farther, how do we counterbalance the negative effects of technology on our work experiences? Now, I feel the need to say I'm not some sort of Luddite. I'm not anti-tech. We're not anti-tech. I think in my own journey, I've gone from techno-optimist to techno-realist, but technology is awesome. I mean, I couldn't be talking with all of you right now without it. We love it in some ways, but there are limits to what it can do for us. And as I'll share with you momentarily, our physical places can play an enormous role in delivering organizational value and value to individuals if it not only supports but balances the use of technology. And if you can't stay for the whole webinar and you have to drop, you've already gotten the key point, but we're going to get a lot deeper into it. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here. I think any good futurist should know the past. And if you ever hear anybody talking about where technology is taking us, ask them, show me the points in the past that are leading to a trajectory, because anybody can come up with wild predictions. And there's nothing more hyped in the world than conversations about tech. But for us, I just want to talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of workplace and technology. I thought about starting back in the 1800s. That felt a little bit much. So I'm going to start in the 60s, and I'm just going to take a few minutes to look at basically leaps ahead, generally by decade. So let's go to 1964. In 1964, in the United States, a concept that had been percolating in Germany called Bürolandschaft, or office landscape, came to the United States. The idea behind Bürolandschaft was applying urban planning principles to the interior of environment to give people a different work experience. And it was kind of revolutionary in that it suggested that people should be able to navigate through a space, have different activities, different experiences, and that the space should be very flexible. It should be agile and flexible to be reconfigured based on these new patterns of use. It's the origins, basically, of open office. And this particular piece, I'm looking at the very bottom here. It was the AIA Journal. I found this on the Modernist Archive. Great website if you've never gone to explore it. AIA Journal in 1974. And it's saying, 10 years in, how are we doing with office landscaping? And it talks about a couple of key things, the first of which being the introduction of the idea from Germany. But if you look at it's very tough to see, but the highlighted piece on the right, the second major impetus was the introduction of systems furniture, specifically Herman Miller's creation of Action Office. I like that there's this reference here because it says, while most widely publicized for its stand-up desks, I don't know if you know this, but when AO was introduced in 1964, it was meant to be like a flexible kit for landscaping, basically. But what really grabbed people's attention was you can stand. We're still talking about that, aren't we? Anyway, the introduction of systems furniture was all about this highly adaptable, reconfigurable way of supporting new patterns of work. If you've read Robert Probst, the inventor of Action Office's piece, The Office of Facility Based on Change, that was a goal. So if we jump forward, that was 64, it was introduced. This piece is in 1974. How are we doing around 1984? Oh my gosh, what happened? This became the life in the office for a lot of people. Clue, what happened were those big white things in the corner of the work surface. Desktop computing, the very thing that Herman Miller had been helping to demonstrate, in 1968. So when I entered the industry in 1994, so that would have been, at least kind of 10 to 15 years into this journey of desktop computing, this was the reality. Desktop computers occupied these big corner work surfaces, and the panels that were meant to be flexible and agile had become an infrastructure for power and data and were not at all flexible. And this is where the question of how do we support technology in the workplace really got its roots, because it was a literal question. How are we supporting these big honking things in the corner of the work surface? And I remember in the early stages of my career, I'm now in my 31st year in the industry, thinking, these spaces are really designed around these IT networks, or in other words, not so much human networks, but IT networks. And the more enlightened companies were not just asking, how do you support the technology, but how do you support the user, to make sure they don't get carpal tunnel or back pain or lose their mind doing data entry all day long. And I think for a lot of us that entered into the industry, and I say industry broadly, not just furniture, but interior design, facilities management, commercial real estate, in the 80s or 90s or early 2000s, like this is what we knew. And when we asked the question, how do we support technology in the workplace? In some ways, it harkens back to a more dated concept. But if we fast forward a little farther, we get to about 2004 and we got Wi-Fi. And it was revolutionary in a sense. Not everything changed right away, but people became untethered from their spaces and could begin to take their technology with them. And when I think of the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, it was really a fascinating time of redefining what supporting technology in the workplace meant, because it no longer really referred to these technologies that were sitting in one place. It was more about what do you do to support these devices that people are traveling with, and how does that change the dynamics of work. There were some really big changes that happened through an IT lens. I'm trying to not use too many IT terms here, but in this period leading kind of right up to 2020, some critical things that had changed were the most important technologies moved from being resident technologies to mobile technologies. I'm old enough that I remember The only mobile tech I had early in my career was a pager, and I'll never forget getting paged once, and I had to pull over and find a payphone. Some of you haven't seen those, and call the office because I forgot to fax something. So I had to go back to the office to fax something. But you know, if you wanted to use technology, you came to the office for network, for printers, for Wi-Fi, for video. You couldn't do video outside of the office, and everything went mobile. And at the same time, there was something in the IT world known as consumerization, not consumerism, but consumerization. It's a fascinating concept that basically described how consumer technologies completely transformed the expectations of the users. They didn't want some slick, comprehensive enterprise technology. They wanted to be able to use their iPhone. They wanted to be able to have experiences in the office that were intuitive and consistent and easy. And oh my goodness, did it rattle the pro AV, you know, audiovisual industry, because at the same time, software was eating hardware. What I mean by that is some of us might remember a smart board or like a digital whiteboard, I'll use that term, used to be like a piece of hardware that hung on the wall from companies like Smartboard. And now it's Miro and Mural or Blackberries. Like I had a Blackberry. I remember when physical therapists or physiotherapists were referring to BlackBerry thumbs because we were all sitting around doing this all day long. What killed the BlackBerry? Was it a better keyboard? Apps. Apps killed the BlackBerry. And so in general, this topic of how do we support technology in the workplace got so complicated for so many people in this era because it's like, it isn't really about providing some sort of hardware device in the office that people need to come to. We had been freed to have more consumer-like mobile experiences primarily through the software we use. And what's the relationship between software and the physical environment? We were putting out pieces within Herman Miller and others in our collective at the time explaining some of these dynamics. I'm not going to go back that far, but I'll just tell you that when quarantine happened and all of these IT folks shifted towards digital workplace solutions, meaning helping people to work elsewhere, it really, really defined the work experience that we're having today. And it's beautifully summarized by this comic that my friend Bob Fox, you might know Bob, he founded Work Design Magazine and is an architect in DC. He sent me this in like 2022. I just think there's so much irony in this one because there's so much debate about like where people are productive, what's happening, but most people just were tethered to their screens. I remember we did a survey in late 2021 when we asked people, if you can go to the office on a given day, why don't you? Too much time on video was one of the top responses. I mean, the feeling was like, well, I'm just going to be doing the same activities from the office as I am here. It's just whatever I'm doing through my device. So why does it matter where I am? And I think this comic nicely summarizes it. All right. Have we had enough time to hang on the comic for now?
Yep, fine, carry on.
Okay. All right. And let me know, you got the purple screen now?
Yep, perfect.
Cool. Yeah, so this was the report that I was mentioning in 2022. HR consultancy called BetterUp released a report called the Connection Crisis Report. And I had the lead researcher, Dr. Christy Limegruber, who's a psychologist, on season 2, episode 1 of our podcast, which is called About Place, to talk about this report. And what she said was that they analyzed 1 million anonymous coaching sessions, because that's what BetterUp does. They provide coaching, and found that digital interaction was very high and interpersonal connection was plummeting. And so they made the case interaction and connection are not the same thing. The timing was interesting because the US Surgeon General had just released a piece that declared an epidemic of social isolation and loneliness in America. And it became quite evident as we poured into BetterUp's research and as we looked at some of our own that this effect that they got to in this graphic at the bottom was the culprit. Not that tech is bad. It's just there's limits to what it can do. And in terms of forming deep interpersonal trust-based connectivity, it was failing us. And you might say, well, that was in the midst of quarantine, but guess what, folks? This has not necessarily gotten better. I'm advancing the slide, so if you can't see it, this is a piece just last month, I believe, from Canadian Business Journal, all about how working remotely is still creating an increase in loneliness. Or you could reframe this: digitally mediated interactions are creating loneliness. And it's not just the occasional author or social scientist saying this. This piece, if you can see the picture of the astronaut in an office, isn't that an interesting visual, from November and December of 2024, it was in Harvard Business Review, a piece, "We're Still Lonely at Work." It's an interesting piece. They kind of wrote off the value of offices a little bit, but it was clear that they were framing it in terms of, if you force people back into an office to do the same work that they're doing at home, that's not going to help, which I agree with. But the issues around loneliness and social isolation is having a significant effect on well-being, which also impacts organizational outcomes. We've seen some additional pieces. This one was last year in Fast Company, excuse me, about, oops, I went too far. Why workers are experiencing sadness. Like, it's becoming beyond an engagement issue. It's a quality of life issue that absolutely affects organizational outcomes, but also just the health of employees. And then, and if there's any issues with the screens advancing, please let me know, Mark. But if I go to this next slide, which features two wonderful people, including one who I think might be on our webinar today, that we had on our podcast just a few weeks ago. On the left is Amy Edmondson, who is renowned globally for introducing the concept, or popularizing the concept, of psychological safety. Psychological safety is when you feel secure enough to speak your mind, to be yourself, to share what you really think. And then the person in the middle, Caitlin Begg, is a sociologist with a focus on technology. She calls herself a socio-technologist, and she's founder of a group called Authentic Social. The two of them joined me on our podcast to talk about a fascinating dynamic where too much screen-based interaction reduces psychological safety, and as a result, it hurts innovation. It hurts our ability to take smart risks. And so if you've ever been looking for that tie between, working remotely and innovation, there it is. But as you can see from the piece that I wrote on the right, I write monthly for Forbes Online. We discussed this. Forcing people into an office through a return to office mandate is not the solution. Why? Well, because it results in a loss of autonomy, which is not what's going to help psychological safety. Instead, we have to come up with a different way of helping to counterbalance all of these negative effects of this imbalance, of too much tech use. And I think we can do it. There's the good news. I think we can do it, and I think facilities, real estate, and interior design professionals play a bigger role here than what you might even realize. So what's the opportunity? The opportunity is to ask a different question, but more importantly, it's to ground ourselves in what the real value of our workplaces are. Now, if you're a regular participant on this webinar series, you will have been introduced to the concept of relationship-based work. Our Director of Design Strategy, Joseph White, covered this just a month or two ago. For those that haven't seen it, I'm going to give you just a very quick recap. But basically what it boils down to is, through our research and through the research of our thought partners, other people that I've mentioned on the call and beyond, we know what people are seeking from an office. This piece was done with, this research was done with Dr. Nigel Osland in the UK in 2024. It was called The Enticing Workplace. It specifically asked, what do you find most desirable? Not just why do you show up, but what do you find most desirable about the home versus office? The results around the office all had to do with interpersonal interactions, teamwork, socializing, connection, which we know is suffering. Did this surprise us? No, because it mirrored data that we had discovered in Future Forum, the project that I talked about before. This is from the last quarter's worth of work, right as we started 2023, 10,000 people surveyed in 6 countries. What is your driver for coming into the office? Among non-executives, camaraderie was, along with collaborating, topped the list. They want quality time with others. FaceTime with management was up there, in-person meetings. I do want to acknowledge quiet space to work is still important. We still have to ensure that because of the nature of that asynchronous collaboration we talked about before. Among executives, they want time with their peers. They want time with managers. They want to be able to collaborate with others in the organization. And so, long story short, the primary driver of an office has to do with how it brings people together. And so starting with the question, how do we support the use of technology? Not a bad question, just can't be the predominant question. The priority needs to be, how do we develop and grow relationships? Now, we called it relationship-based work to highlight its complementary nature to activity-based work. If you're familiar with activity-based work, it's been around for 40 years or so. In fact, we just had Zoe from Veltone on the webinar series, I just think last month, in fact. Activity-based work is a very smart practice. Let's take an inventory of all the different activities that might need to happen in a space. Let's make sure the variety of space supports it. However, we should acknowledge that many of the activities, if you think of those pictures I showed you that once could only be done in the office, now can be done almost anywhere. What's unique to the office? It's the people you're going to find there that you're not going to invite over to your spare bedroom to have a conversation while working from home. And so in the same way that we've thought about and cataloged and assessed the need for activities, we need to do this with positive relational interactions. And that leads me to basically a point of view that if we ask the question, just in the context of relationship-based planning and focusing on relationship-based work, how do we balance the use of technology, still be productive and have good technology experiences, but make sure that the technology doesn't dominate or overcome the thing that people most want from the workplace? It leads us to take a different perspective on how we interact with people and how we interact with technology, and maybe just ask some better questions. And what I want to do for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, is give you some examples so that this doesn't seem theoretical. We've used a variety of thought starters when we talk about relationship-based work, and I've pulled some of them just to be able to unpack for you how a more balanced approach to this results in different types of spaces. So you should be seeing momentarily, if you don't already, a picture of a cafe, like a coffee bar. Just a social hub. Many of us have it in the workplace. These are really valuable spaces. They can provide a lot of meaningful interaction to people. If we started with the question, how do we support technology in a cafe? We would probably think about it as a place to do some co-working, a place to get emails done. This is a good place to go have a cup of coffee and use a laptop. It would probably result in a lot of 30-inch high tables with power going to them, maybe some large format displays like big televisions for maybe an all-team meeting. That's probably what would result, would be a space that would be a little less flexible and a whole lot more uniform. But instead, we can say, well, how do we balance the need to, yes, use a laptop to get some email done, or maybe show something during an all-hands meeting, but let's prioritize the relational interactions and look at some of the choices that were made. Let's start with posture. There's a link between the psychology of posture and our relationships. Think about sitting into a lounge environment with someone, and how you're probably not going to sit in a lounge chair for 3 minutes. You're going to settle in. It might be somebody you don't know very well. It might be a chance to say, hey, let's just get to know each other. Let's talk. Let's make eye contact. If you happen to have somebody that's using a wheelchair, it's a wonderful chance to include them in the conversation. You might be inclined to pull out a laptop, but probably not. A lounge-based interaction is going to be much more conversational. Contrast that with a counter height or bar height. I mean, when I think of sitting at like a bar height, maybe this is a distinctly American reference, but I think of like having a beer and some chicken wings or chips or bitterball or whatever you might eat. Like it's such a familial, like you go and you interact with people you know well, sometimes for a minute. Hey, how's it going? How was the weekend? Or other times, like, let's just talk about something, but it's a very different type of relational interaction at a bar height setting than it would be a lounge setting. And then that standard table height is going to be probably a little bit more formal. But look at in this situation how there's also a balance of privacy. there on the corridor, you can sit. Maybe you're somebody new to the organization. Maybe you're an intern. Maybe you're somebody that feels disconnected, and you're just going to increase the likelihood of a chance encounter. And then if you want to have a more focused conversation, you can move your way back into some of those booths and have that feeling like there's a little bit more intimacy in that conversation. There's still a high degree of flexibility. If you want to have an all-team meeting, put a retractable screen from the ceiling. For heaven's sakes, don't put TVs with the news on it in a space like this. That's depressing. That's the last thing anybody wants to see when we interact. So you get where I'm going here. Asking the question, how do we support technology is useful? Asking the question, how do we balance the use of technology in this space with really positive relational interactions? That is the unlock. Let's use some other spaces. Private offices. I know in some parts of the world, private offices aren't that popular, but here in the States, the biggest categories of lease signers have been legal, public sector, finance, insurance. So we've been actually selling a lot of private offices, but they don't have to be the old school status driven, hierarchical private office. If we were to start with the question, how do we support good technology use in a private office? We'd probably end up with a desk in the middle of the room with a big flat screen monitor and a video camera on it pointing back towards a credenza. Is that bad? Well, it is in terms of interacting with other human beings. It's tough enough to go to the threshold of a private office and be like, hey, can I come in? But when you've got that big old honking desk and then a monitor in your way, it just seals the people off from one another. For those that have seen the show 30 Rock, think of Jack Donaghy's negotiation chairs. What have we done here? Well, we've provided a very ergonomic, healthy place to do individual work. But if somebody comes and you want to have a positive interaction, look, there's a table. It is not a table that has a head of the table or any sort of connotation of status or hierarchy. It's a place where an intern could feel comfortable talking with a senior vice president on a more kind of grounded nature. And there's video there, so that instead of just supporting the individual using a video call, now you can invite somebody into a video call. The height of that camera, the sight lines, what's known as gaze angle, whether or not the geometry allows it basically to feel like you're making eye contact, it's all well planned. But this is a private office that just excels in supporting healthy relational interactions. Let's go to a few more. Let's talk about video spaces. Not every video space needs to look like it was plucked out of the Death Star. Some sort of slick, I don't know, kind of institutional space. And we can avoid the historical traps of the long, skinny table that to the remote participant feels like a bowling alley where they can't see anybody's face, or the resurgence of these rooms with banana-shaped tables. I turned my camera off, so you can't see my hands right now, but I'm holding my hands up in exasperation. These rooms with banana-shaped tables are designed with the assumption that the only reason to go in the room is to stare at whoever might not be in the room. It's extremely awkward. This was popularized with telepresence in the 2000s, failed miserably, and somehow they're back on people's radar again. This room supports a wonderful video interaction. The sight lines are great. The content display makes sense. It's the right size. But look at what we did. It's smaller. Why is it smaller? Well, because you don't find 10 people on video calls as much today with more distributed work. You tend to find rooms that have 2, 3, 4 people. Having 3 people in a huge room is weird relationally. You're all separated from each other. Going and sitting next to someone in a big room feels like, dude, what are you doing? You're in my space. But here we can easily support 3, 4, 5 people in a very natural situation. And guess what? If you don't want to use the video, this is a great room. It's got this awesome residential vibe, but from a lighting standpoint, acoustics, etc., it's still beautifully planned to support video. So speaking of turning the video off, how would you like to have a room or two like this in your office? This is a picture from one of our Knoll showrooms, which is why there's graphics on the wall with the products. But I have increasingly seen rooms like this becoming popular at some of the site visits that we did in 2024. It's clear the intent. Put away the technology for this half an hour. You've got a one-on-one with an employee that might be struggling. You're trying to, talk with another department head because your teams aren't working effectively together. It's just a wonderfully human, inclusive, relational place to be. I think every office needs to have 1 or 2 like it. I'll move on to one last example, which is a quiet zone or a study hall. In this case, it's really important to be able to use your individual device for focused, concentrative work. But even here, we can benefit from saying, what does it look like to balance the interactions? Because you know what wouldn't do very well here? Here is a video call. Like if somebody were to grab their AirPods and start taking a video call from the middle of a quiet zone, oh my gosh, how disruptive could that be? I mentioned we had our team meeting at Atlassian in Austin. They took a zone of their floor plan and made it the place for open office video calls. They actually said, you want to take a video call in the open? Go do it over there. That's where everybody's taking the calls. By doing that, they freed up the other areas to be without so many video calls. It was a stroke of genius, I think. But again, I'm beating this drum pretty hard. Yeah, we should definitely support the use of technology. We have to be productive. We have to equip people to use tools. And we have to make sure that the priority of that doesn't interfere with the primary value proposition of offices, which is to improve the relational health of organizations. I have one last quick part, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A. At this point, you might be thinking, Ryan, you've been talking to us for 40 minutes. You haven't mentioned AI. That was kind of by design, if I'm being honest, friends. I am fascinated with the topic of artificial intelligence. It's not a new topic for us. Actually, right when I came to Miller in 2012, it was one of the topics that we dove into at that point. And what I have found is that there's so much hype right now about AI that to have an effective conversation usually means grounding us in something that's relatable to people that are not all into kind of the crazy headlines. Talking about machine learning, predictive analytics, Gen AI, those sort of things loses people real fast. It's important that we understand it, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be the focus of the conversation. For us, I think the conversation's very well served by talking about three things. So here's three ways that AI is going to affect our world in the workplace and already is affecting our world in order of how far it's gotten. The first is just smart buildings, prop tech, AI-enabled buildings, buildings that have technologies in them to produce data that can be used to better manage the facility. I think of smart HVAC energy management systems. This is a very good thing to do. If your company hasn't dove into it yet, you should. It's a way to save money. It's a way to protect the planet. And these systems are quite mature. And there's lots of great examples out there. If we move from like smart buildings into AI-enabled tools, then we're getting into a little bit more experimental things. And by tools, I'm talking about it might be a design tool, like Herman Miller partnered with Autodesk to write some proprietary code on top of their generative design platform in 2016 and 17. It's basically, we created a product called Compass that helps designers. The goal is never to replace a designer. The goal is to like put powerful tools in the hands of a designer. So tools like that exist. There's user tools like Robin for desk scheduling. There's a really amazing platform called Calven, Calven. We featured Jeremy Pollack, the founder of that, on season 3 of our podcast, that looks at how people are using space in an unassigned environment and basically dynamically allocates space to different teams. So these are the sort of things that all of us should be investigating and maybe trying and maybe adopting. It's not too late to do it. The question is, does it make life better? And is it something that we can use to improve our industry? But I think where we get asked the most questions is around what's the effect of AI on work? And how does that impact what we do with workplace? I'll just tell you, there's huge debate within the AI community about this. And there's evidence to suggest a lot of different things. If I were to sum it up fairly simply, the theory, big asterisk around theory, because we have yet to see if it plays out, is that AI should reduce the number of rote, technical, complicated activities that people do. As an example, I mentioned that I write for Forbes. I'll write a piece, I'll dump it into ChatGPT and say, please check my grammar. And sure enough, I got some apostrophes wrong. I may have spelled a word wrong. Like, it has saved me dozens of hours of work at this point, and I'm really thankful for it. Has generative AI totally changed my work experience? Probably not. Has it changed all of yours? Maybe it's starting to. I talked with Debbie Lovich at BCG, who was one of our partners on Future Forum, and she leads their talent research and consulting about what organizations are doing with Gen AI all the time. It's mostly experimental. There are some examples, like take Grammarly, like that's a nice tool, isn't it? I guess I could use Grammarly instead of ChatGPT, but we don't fully know. If the predictions are true that AI reduces the technical, rote, procedural, complicated things that we do, it will free us up to do things that humans are better at. And what will people want to do with that time? Well, I think the evidence suggests they'll want to interact with each other and collaborate with each other and build relationships and have more productive innovation. So in some ways, our views on AI relate right back to relationship-based work. In my final minute, for those that enjoy some of the hype around AI, I'll get a little weird with you, which is, like any technology, it can be really helpful or really destructive. Maybe you've seen that some of the pioneers of AI are saying some kind of terrifying things, like Hinson saying that he's shortened the timeline and he thinks AI will end humanity probably in the next 20 to 30 years. Like, okay, it's easy to write off something like that, but when it comes from the actual inventors of AI technologies, it's a little concerning. The theory is that it'll outsmart us, but if you look more practically, AI is being used today to create harmful effects on our work and our world because of what it's done to how we consume information. The AI isn't necessarily launching missiles like in the movie War Games or sending robots like in Terminator, but there are bad actors and nation states that are using basically algorithms to tee up information to divide us, what is sometimes known as the splinter net. I wrote a piece about this in Forbes a while back, but what's really interesting is as people get into their bubbles and surround themselves with like individuals at their place of worship or their places of higher education or their social circles, the one place that we probably can be assured that people with very different worldviews will interact is at work, because there's an economic incentive to come into work and sit down with somebody whose worldview might be very different, and not just to get along, but to actually produce something together. So will offices save humanity from the harmful effects of AI? Maybe. But the best thing we can do is to continue to promote places that bring people together in very human ways without ignoring the tools, but by ensuring that we have the best possible experiences with other human beings while we use those tools. Okay, I was shooting for 10:45. I went 1 minute late. I'm sorry about any sort of technical hiccups that we may have had along the way. I'm going to stop sharing content and turn my camera back on, and hopefully that doesn't create any latency. What kind of questions or thoughts do all of you have?
Okay, what we've got quite a few. I'm going to make a couple of observations first. Caitlin made an observation. One of your comments was reminiscent of the Alone Together book by Sherry Turkle.
Sherry Turkle.
Yep.
Yeah,
So
Sherry and I presented at Work Tech New York in 2013, and I sat next to her, and I thought, wow, she's kind of a downer. But then I read her research, and I thought, oh, yeah. It also relates, by the way, to the concept of social ergonomics, which CBS and others, Herman Miller, holistic ergonomics from Knoll. There's a few ties here for sure.
yeah. Jacqueline Link made the observation that going into the office in a hybrid sense is sometimes time consuming because you have to reconnect everything that you've unconnected from home. And everything is right where you left it when you're at home.
I mean, and there's consumerization at play. And let's remember that people have had the chance to personalize their home work experience. So the number of times, in fact, I was asked by a large design firm in Minneapolis a while back, is the dual monitor thing really that important? Because people seem to get real upset if they have it at home but not in the office. And the answer is like, yeah, if they've tailored their whole workflow and then they come to a space that doesn't support it, it is frustrating. This is consumerization. It's not just consumerization of IT, it's consumerization of workplace. We expect consumer-like experiences, and it's tough. You have to support what's in people's pockets and purses and backpacks. And that should be the mentality, not we're going to put like a big Surface Hub or some other slick technology in a space and expect people will somehow change their tech usage. It just doesn't happen.
Okay, Sophie asks, she's actually curious when you were talking about aloneness or loneliness or whatever you want to call it. I'm curious about the real cause and correlation.
Good question.
Any views on that?
I'll edit myself to say there's a whole lot of things causing loneliness. And it's not just technology. and it is different in different parts of the world for sure. So this might be a very different conversation for our friends in Bangalore or in Seoul. But I do think that what I'm not sure if Caitlin Begg is on the call, but what Caitlin
Yes, and she's put a few comments in.
you,
Yeah.
you have so Caitlin introduced me to a couple of concepts I just love. One of which is Lefebvre's idea of the atomized individual, which isn't a few decades old. It's, if I remember right, it's a couple hundred years old. It basically describes that the natural use of technology will pull us apart. And it's just a factor we have to counterbalance. Oh, you want to watch a movie? Do you go to the theater or do you stream it? You're a musician. Do you want to cut a track with somebody? Do you go into a studio for a week or do you cut your piece in London and somebody else's in Nashville? Like the more we adopt tech, the more it tends to be distributed and asynchronous. And so we have to work to be productive in the broadest sense of the word, not just work, at good experiences being together.
Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight, and Phil, you make a very good point. You just wanted to make sure that being alone isn't necessarily means you're lonely. And
No, different. No, in fact, you can experience deep loneliness while surrounded by others. So this is not about being alone. In fact, if I go back to a concept that Caitlin and I have talked about, which is Marc Augé's concept of the non-place. A non-place is a place in our world that lacks identity and significance. And sometimes it's fine, like the post office, you just want to go get some stamps and mail a package. But we should not aspire to have people come into offices and be surrounded by others and feel alone. It's one of my concerns about activity-based working being pushed too far. We don't want to create this sense of anonymity that I'm here, but I don't really know any of these folks around me, and I'm just here to get a few activities done.
great, and I love this. I find it a little bit creepy, but Pallavi said that during the pandemic, it was the loneliest we've ever been. There's a term called skin hunger. It can happen when someone is unable to interact with others, such as during social distancing. I guess it's that need for a hug, isn't it? That's kind of just that need to.
It is. I love Pallavi. Pallavi, if you're
Yeah.
here, I'd give you a hug. But no, it's true. We crave meaningful interpersonal interaction, and we have to work to maintain it, but not just at work, but beyond.
Jason asks, is there any research in terms of raises or rise in salaries or advancement for in-person workers versus remote?
There is. I don't have any specific studies to cite, and I have mixed emotions about the work that's been done because you could make the case that being in person results in better career advancement and use that as some sort of leverage or kind of quiet threat that if you're not there, you might lose out. But it relates back to some extent to presenteeism, and presenteeism can be digital or physical. I think what's probably more interesting to me is the studies around informal learning and information sharing, like how somebody, when they're around other people, can learn and grow and develop and form trust-based relationships, and that advances their career and, yes, their salary as well. I think it's interesting that Malcolm Gladwell, Simon Sinek, Adam Grant have all in their own ways said to people earlier in their careers, go spend more time in the office. Is it about getting a pay raise? Maybe. It's about development. There's just a lot that can't be done exclusively through technology.
Yeah, I think you've covered this a bit, but Anne makes the point that when we stay at home and work, we're often missing out on those weak ties in our community. Another element of mental health that ties us to our community. You wanted to talk about those weak ties, strong ties that we.
And we love Mark Granovetter's framework of strong ties, weak ties. Granovetter is in his 90s at Stanford. We've even had a call with him to talk about it. But weak ties are your extended networks. At work, it's all the people you probably don't work with every day. They're critical to our sense of security, first and foremost, our feeling of belonging. But it's also how organizations innovate. Like to have one group work on something is fine, but when you got to scale it, if those teams aren't in healthy relationship with another, it breaks down. There's a lot of value. Like, let's just say you've got a bunch of distributed team members and they say, well, why would I go to the office? All my immediate team members are somewhere else. The answer is to build weak ties, not just strong ties. Like, what other groups do you think you should be working more closely with? What other friends can you form in the office? On our own team call yesterday, we just had a conversation about how our team, 28 people in 22 cities, are spending more time with some of our sales teams and others in their locales just to be a part of something. It's healthy for us. Again, it doesn't work as well when you force someone to do it. but if you can build those relationships and encourage and nurture those positive interactions, it's a good thing all around.
Yeah, and that being forced to do it does highlight a focus from Susanna, who said, is it possible that people are feeling sad because even though we know social in-person interaction is important, we've actually lost a sense of personal control when we get mandated to come back to the office?
Yep. Google reactance theory. Reactance theory is a word from it's a psychological concept that basically says if you tell somebody that they have to do something and they perceive it as a loss of autonomy or freedom, they will do the opposite. And here in the States, we had all sorts of fights over mask mandates and vaccine mandates. And so why would we think that office mandates, return to office mandates, would produce anything other than reactance? Yeah, using the office as a tool of control it might produce some short-term gains, but I think it's super harmful for our industry because we don't want people around the world seeing physical workplaces as something punitive. They need to see the value in it.
Katie asks, are you seeing more people wanting to go into the office if they have an assigned space versus an unassigned reservable space?
I will direct you to About Place, season 4, episode, I think it was 7 with Nigel Oslin. It varies based on how it's executed. It varies around the world, but yes, we think it's important for people to gain a sense of place attachment, that relationship with a place. It often relates to ownership. If you sit at the same chair at the dining room table each night, you might call that my chair. That expresses some need for psychological ownership over a chair, a place. I think team neighborhoods can produce a sense of team ownership. I think there's other ways of doing shared desking well. So it's not that it can't be done well. It's just if you do it poorly and people see it as a loss of ownership or a loss of control, it's not going to make the situation better. It's going to make it worse.
I'm going to do something here. I'm going to read a question from someone and answer it with someone else's comment, if you don't mind.
Brilliant.
Which is, okay.
I'll enjoy some coffee.
Okay. Are there any generational differences when it comes to perspectives on the workplace and going into work? And I just thought this was interesting. That basically you may get this, Ryan. This is from Ian, but the uses cases for like relationship-based work depend on the cohort. To give the most extreme example, I'm fine with majority home working now, but I would have disliked it at the start of my career and would probably still dislike it somewhat at the start of a new role. In short, it's heterogeneous, not homogeneous.
Oh, Ian, what a better answer than I was going to give. Yeah, that's a great answer. I'll also just say if we're talking about career stages or life stages, I think you can tie some things together. If we're talking about, and you didn't use this, but if we're talking about generational labels, Z, X, Y, throw those all out. They don't hold up to good examination. They're arbitrary based on their year cutoffs, and they overlook many other factors that are more powerful. But yeah, I think in terms of career stage and life stage, big differences. And just look at the number of people that maybe don't have established weak ties that are younger or newer to an organization that are showing up to a lot of these sites regularly. And it's people like me. I've been around 30 years. I can probably accomplish a lot of stuff with a text message that might be less inclined, but they need us. Sorry, I keep plugging the podcast, but with Lego Group, season 4, episode 1, they communicated to their employees a hybrid policy that basically said, we want to respect your work-life balance, but you have a social obligation to one another. You have an obligation to support your teammates, to help develop younger employees, to make sure that all voices are being heard. They took management out of the equation, and I think what a wonderful balance that strikes. And it overcomes some of those generational, demographic, and other things by coalescing people together around look out for each other. They connect and take care of each other.
Yeah, and Brian was raising the issue of team agreements. That makes a big difference, and we've had this discussion as well before. Ryan, yep. It's 2 minutes. It's 2 minutes to the hour. I just wanted to say a great big thank you for your time and for your insights. Love that. Everyone on, please be aware that I will share the chat with Ryan so that he can have a look at it. But I put his email address in the chat, and we'll also put a link to his LinkedIn profile. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And you will be taken to a website when you leave today to give us some feedback. Ryan, yep. Thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, my friend. Everyone, ask the question, how can we use our places to balance the use of technology and interpersonal relationships? Let's get to a better place.